Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Happy Hearing podcast. I'm Dr. Ruth Reisman, an audiologist and full-time professor here in New York City, and we are back today for our 19th episode. I'm here with my co-host, Carly Sightgrove, who will also introduce our guest.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Happy Hearing podcast, episode 19. I'm Carly Sygrove, a hearing loss coach, advocate, and writer. And today we're joined by Emily Truell. Emily was diagnosed with a brain tumour at the age of 27, and the treatment that she received for this destroyed her hearing nerve. She now wears a bone-anchored hearing aid, which is also referred to as BAHA. Emily is also a blogger, and she's a passionate advocate for hearing assistance, especially around motherhood and a family business. Welcome to the podcast, Amy.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here. I've been a fangirl of Carly's for some time, so I'm especially pleased to be invited.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, Emily, let's start by you sharing a bit about yourself. And maybe for those unfamiliar, could you also explain what an acoustic neuroma is and how it affects hearing and balance?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I am in Wisconsin and I own and operate a family business. I'm third generation in my family, which happens to be running campgrounds. And when I was 27 years old, I was diagnosed with an acoustic neuroma. I had noticed at work that when we were testing phones, I couldn't speak on the phone on my left side anymore. And at first I thought I was a hypochondriac because it happens that a few months before that, my dad actually had sudden sensory neural hearing loss. And so I was familiar with that. And I thought I was kind of crazy for thinking that I couldn't hear out of one ear suddenly. And it turned out, of course, that I had the acoustic neuroma. An acoustic neuroma is a brain tumor that is benign, it's not cancerous, and it grows on the vestibular nerve. The vestibular nerve and the auditory nerves are really tight together and kind of combine coming out of your ear. And so oftentimes what notifies you that you have this brain tumor is the hearing loss. That's very typical, although some people, it's symptoms of balance issues like vertigo and dizziness that get them to the doctor. For me, I realized in retrospect that I had had some dizziness problems, but I had spoken with my doctor about it and he thought it was just a headache. It didn't last long, or I had it once after a chiropractic appointment. But because they are slow growing benign tumors, it's often very incremental how it impacts both your hearing and your balance. And so a lot of times your brain is compensating for a long time until it gets to a certain point, and then maybe you get more symptoms. They expect, since I had a larger one, that it may have been growing for as long as 10 years prior to my diagnosis. And that's why the balance, I just had been a little clumsy or like a little off balance here and there, but it wasn't dramatic for me. For some people, it's different. So the primary notice was the hearing loss. And when I had my surgery and they actually saw the nerve, they said that the nerve was pretty damaged. And so it's interesting that I could hear so well so long. And they said sometimes that hearing nerve is very resilient till like the last bit. And then all of a sudden you have that notice of, oh, wait, I'm not hearing well anymore in that situation. So a lot of times folks with acoustic neuromas, it's not an emergency because it's slow growing and it's benign. I was in a situation that was sort of a medium amount of emergency because it was large. So it wasn't like I could put this off for a very long time, but it wasn't like rushed to the hospital. That doesn't happen very often with an acoustic neuroma.
Interesting. Is there any kind of like family history, or was there anyone else in the family that suffered from it?
So no, it's very interesting. An acoustic neuroma, if it is one-sided, is not genetic. They do think it arises from a chromosome misfiring, but it's not something that I inherited from someone or can give to someone. if you have acoustic neuromas on both sides, it's a different type of diagnosis called neurofibromatosis type 2, and that is genetic. And it means that you will often have many nerve tumors, not just those two sides. So in that case, you often have someone in your family with it, or your children might inherit it. They don't know exactly what causes the chromosome to misfire to give folks an acoustic neuroma, but there's no one else in my family who has had one. Randomly, my mother did have a different kind of benign brain tumor 7 years before I got diagnosed with my acoustic neuroma. So in some ways, I had someone in my family who understood and supported me, but not anyone with an acoustic neuroma, actually. I'd never even heard of it or known someone who had had one. And that's very common. It's considered a rare disease. 1 in 100,000 people have them. And so a lot of times you get this diagnosis and you're like, I don't even know what this is or like where to start, which is why I was really grateful to find the Acoustic Neuroma Association very early in my journey and my diagnosis. I'd gotten the call, you have a brain tumor and we want you to come to the doctor. And while I was driving to the doctor, I'm Googling, what is this diagnosis that I was just told over the phone? And that's when I found the Acoustic Neuroma Association, which supported me through my whole journey.
Mm-hmm. Emily, it's interesting listening to you because talking about Googling this condition and this kind of thing, because as you know, I had sudden hearing loss. And one of the precautions that happens when you have sudden hearing loss is you then will have an MRI. The MRI is generally to check, is there an underlying condition such as acoustic neuroma that could have caused this loss? So I actually went through the process of having this MRI. I Googled as well, the same. I Googled acoustic neuroma, seeing what is this? What is this thing that it could have been? And, you know, it's even though you read non-cancerous, you read all these things, it's still a huge thing to kind of, I guess, for you to come to terms with, for me to kind of get my head around that this could have caused my hearing loss. When I actually got my results, in one way it was positive because I didn't have acoustic neuroma, I didn't have that. And another way it was kind of like, well, what is it? So I don't know. I think my journey is obviously different to yours, but this acoustic neuroma, it is this thing that unless I think you've had it or you've got it or somebody in your family or friends circle has it, it's not something I don't think that's really well known. Yeah, I'm wondering when you first had that diagnosis then and you were, driving to the hospital, what was going through your head? How did this impact you at that time?
Yeah, yeah, it's hard. Waiting on those MRI results are hard and being in that situation. And I just wanted to say too that when I had seen the ear, nose, and throat doctor, I had already had a hearing test and we had found the severe hearing loss in one ear. He was really convinced it wasn't an acoustic neuroma. He was trying to come up with all these other reasons, like, it could be the virus, it could be this. And he really wanted to find something in my lifestyle that I did that may have taken my hearing. And I was like, no, I really can't think of anything. And so he kind of ordered the MRI, like, well, okay, I guess I have to, because he tried to do the nerve test and prove that the nerve was working. And I failed that, obviously. And so he was like, but don't worry, you don't have an acoustic neuroma. Like, these are so rare. I've only seen 6 in my really long career. And of course, I was lucky number 7, which was very amusing. And I often hear that from folks that their doctors are so convinced that they don't have an acoustic neuroma, and then they do, when I'm talking to people who've been diagnosed. So yeah, when I was driving down, that day was hard. I was definitely worried about the future. I had a 2-year-old daughter at the time of diagnosis. And that day was a real flurry because I wasn't supposed to go to the doctor. And I had actually been told I wouldn't get my MRI results for like 2 weeks. But then they saw the tumor, so they called me the next day. So I was supposed to be at work, and my husband was supposed to be with my daughter, and we had to find someone to take the daughter and someone to cover work and, all of that craziness. And I had maybe more realistic picture than average of what brain surgery and brain surgery recovery look like because I had been there for my mom through that process. So I was definitely nervous about what was upcoming, but I think for me anyway, in those sorts of situations, I go into kind of a like emergency lockdown of like, okay, I got to figure out the next step. I have to like, and you start hyper focusing on like organizing and getting the information and like one thing at a time is very interesting because I felt like I got into a survival mode and that survival mode lasted for quite some time. And it was a challenging transition to get back to actually living life and not just like making it through.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, I remember having when I had my sudden hearing loss, and as much as I know about audiology, even when I went for the MRI, I was, in typical Ruth fashion, I'm just, joking around with the staff and that's just my personality. And he left me like I was in a good mood and he comes back and I'm in tears, crying, and he's like, what just happened? How did you go from one emotion to the next? And I'm like, I don't know. I just sat here for a few minutes and thought about like what's possibly can it be, and thinking that they potentially could find an acoustic neuroma was just such a scary thought. So like you're saying, you're sitting there in the MRI, you have no idea what they're going to end up finding or not finding, and until you get those results and then the outcome. And even though, let's say, I mean, in my case, it wasn't there, but still, it's like, okay, so then what caused this? Like, what is going on then? Is something else that needs to be identified? Or even when you don't, when you have the answers, maybe that, like you said, you go now into survival mode and go into those next steps. And then when you don't have the answers, that anxiety still lingers for so long.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's a lot of anxiety in the whole process for sure. And for me, the diagnosis day, I don't think was the hardest day, and maybe partly because I was in shock, but in some ways I had expected it because I knew what they were looking for and I had started researching it and it fit. And I was like, oh, shoot, like this is probably actually, and so in that way, it wasn't really a surprise. It's interesting, like where the hard points come. I think one of the hardest days for me was, or hardest parts in general, was choosing treatment. So when you have an acoustic neuroma, there's typically three treatment choices. There's surgery, there's radiation, and then there's watch and wait. I wasn't a candidate for watch and wait because my tumor was 3 centimeters, which was large enough that we needed to do something. And 3 centimeters is kind of on the line of what's safe for radiation. Some doctors cut it off at 2.5 and some 3. So I didn't really feel comfortable with radiation because I was like at that edge or maybe over it. So it was surgery. Okay, well, that's figured out. Well, now once I was looking at surgery, there's 3 different surgical approaches. And one of them my tumor was too large for, but the other two I could have potentially chosen between. And one of them, they go through the back of your skull, and one of them, they go through like the ear. And the back is called the retrosigmoid, and through the ear is called translabyrinthine, or translab is what a lot of people say for short. The translab goes through the bony labyrinth of the ear. So you for sure will be single-sided deaf when you wake up because those structures are removed. The retrosigmoid, there's a chance of preserving hearing. And I had to pick which surgical approach. And even though I had severe hearing loss, I had to decide if I was going to wake up single-sided deaf or if I was going to try and keep that 10% and like have a chance of having hearing when I woke up. And the more I researched it, the more it seemed like with my size tumor, I had almost no chance of retaining hearing anyway. And I knew all of that. And my doctors really recommended that I do the translab approach because the facial nerve is also right near those other nerves. And the doctor said due to my tumor size and location, he'd have a much better chance of preserving my facial function, which of course is very important if we did the translab approach. And so ultimately, that was the decision I made. But that day, I just bawled because like to feel like you're pulling the trigger on removing your own hearing, like that was really a hard and emotional step, even though it was logical and right and rational. And I did all my research, like that emotional part of picking it was really, really hard.
Just listening to you talking about it, Emily, is emotional. Like I can't actually, I can only start to imagine how difficult that decision must have been. Yeah, I can I can feel your emotion in that. I know, like me, you had a few similar strategies for coping. Like you said, you went to survival mode, you did your research, you had your next steps. It's just like what I did. But you also started writing a blog as well. And I'm not sure at what point you started this blog. I'm going to let you tell us. So the blog is called the Lucky Brain Tumor Blog. So I'd like you to tell us about the blog, and can you tell us about the name as well?
Absolutely. Yes. So, the name is twofold. So, like I said, I was lucky number 7 when I was diagnosed with
Mm.
my ear, nose, and throat doctor. And the other thing that brought the name on is as I was going through my journey and talking to medical professionals and friends and family, even anyone who's familiar with acoustic neuromas would say, well, you're lucky it's an acoustic neuroma. If you had to have a best brain tumor, this is the best brain tumor to have. And you're like, okay, but like, doesn't feel good to have a brain tumor ever of any sort. Like, I'm not feeling real lucky. I feel more like I lost at long odds than that I won right now. But it's a common thing that gets said to folks with acoustic neuromas. I have found as I've been involved in my support group and my various volunteering, interacting with other people who have been diagnosed with acoustic neuromas, it's a common thing that gets said. And so I just find that very funny. So it's lucky in parentheses because obviously you don't feel lucky when you have a brain tumor, but it is true that it is very, very treatable compared to a lot of brain tumors. There are good outcomes. For example, I have a family member who works for the National Health Institute and is very involved in research, especially for cancer. And I spoke with him about the diagnosis, and he was like, honestly, I wouldn't even do a trial for this because it has such great proven outcomes from the regular treatments, which it's not every terrible diagnosis that has that. I chose to start the blog fairly recently in my history. It's been going like a year and a half in that ballpark. And how that all came about is I have been volunteering for the Acoustic Neuroma Association for some time. I first was a peer mentor, and then I created a young adult support group because I wanted to create a space for other folks who were young adults dealing with this diagnosis to connect. Because it is a rare disease, it can be hard to find other people with this diagnosis that's like in your community or versus like if you have breast cancer, you probably can think of like 10 people off the top of your head who had breast cancer you could talk to. You're probably not going to know someone with an acoustic neuroma diagnosis. And if you are diagnosed with acoustic neuroma, you're often middle-aged or older. It's more common in that population. So I went to a support group, which I had to drive like 2.5 hours to get to. And when I got there, I was the only person in the room under 50. And everyone's sharing stories and they're talking about how they dealt with their diagnosis by retiring. And I'm like, well, that's great. Not an option for me at 27. So I was looking for places to connect with other people sharing similar experiences. So I created this young adult support group. And it's become an online community also, and it's really grown. And as I was interacting with people through my support group, over and over again, I was experiencing people talking about how they're unhappy with their hearing loss because the vast majority of people who have an acoustic neuroma diagnosis have hearing loss. Most of us are single-sided deaf or have significant hearing loss in one ear. And a lot of them were struggling. They weren't loving how their hearing loss was impacting their life, their work, their relationships, but they did not feel comfortable getting a hearing assistance device of any sort. I heard this refrain over and over again, and I absolutely love my bone anchored hearing aid. It makes my life so much better. I'm so glad I got it. I call it like my security blanket. Like I'm Linus with my bone anchored hearing aid. I don't want to leave the house without it ever. And to hear people say they were unhappy but unwilling to find solutions because a lot of times because of stigma, sometimes because of other barriers like cost and insurance and time and or just even functionality. It just made me really sad to hear. And I decided that I wanted to work on the hearing aid stigma, was one of my big goals, but also some other advice and other resources. I really wanted to exist and be more accessible to people. I wanted folks to find it sooner in their acoustic neuroma journeys or their hearing loss journeys than I did. And so I decided to start writing as a way to reach those folks, as a way to work on things like stigma and finding resources and all those different things. And it's become another way to help more people to get my voice out there. And I've gotten a lot of really great feedback. I think the thing that has been the biggest surprise that I've really enjoyed is that when I started it, I was thinking, okay, this is going to be a place where people who have acoustic neuromas or who have hearing loss find resources. It's going to be a place where they feel seen, where they can connect with someone like them and be like, yes, I'm not alone. That was my vision. And I've gotten a lot of feedback that it does that. But what I didn't expect is that people would come to my blog and read the words and be like, yes, this is my experience. Here, partner, husband, friend, loved one, read this, understand my experience. And so many people have said it's been so wonderful because they couldn't find the words to describe what single-sided hearing loss was like. And here I put the words in their mouth for them, and it's been really helpful for their relationships. And I've just been so incredibly pleased and honored that I was able to do that.
I love that, Emily. I've heard similar as well, and I think sometimes words seem to mean more when they're coming from somebody else. So, for example, I do find like I have people saying, I've been telling my partner or my friends or whatever many times about, my struggles, but it was only when I gave them your blog or they found something online, something that isn't directly from them, that they can say, this is what I'm experiencing. And because it's actually not written, it's not part of their circle, it's not by somebody in that group, it's something completely outside saying the same thing. It's almost like validation, isn't it? It's like, look, somebody else is having this too, somebody else experiences this too, and this is what I'm going through. And people do tend to, I don't know why it is, but people tend to take more notice. So I think it's really great that people are using your blog for their own words to share. And yeah, I wonder why that is, but the main thing is that it works.
Yes, absolutely. And it's also funny because sometimes you find things you didn't even know. Like, for example, I have a really great opportunity because I connect with so many people with this diagnosis. So I have this sort of qualitative study situation where I'm like, oh, this comes up frequently. So I can see that this is something that a lot of people are struggling with, or this is a good topic. And one thing I stumbled across randomly is a lot of us who've had an acoustic neuroma tend to have some susceptibility to heat or some need for extra water, like we get dehydrated more easily, which seems random and not like something you would expect. It's not the hearing loss, it's not the balance, it's not all of the common things that we have in the pamphlets. And as we did more research and some folks reached out to doctors, they think it's because of saliva production being impacted from that hearing nerve. But none of us knew that we all had this. We all thought it was just us. And we started talking, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait, we have it, and I did a blog post about it, and someone was like, I've had this problem, and my husband told me I'm crazy, but now I have this blog post to prove I'm not crazy. And sometimes those moments of just, wow, it's not just me, it can really matter.
Yeah, you said so many interesting things, and coming from like the provider perspective, I picked up on some of the things that you were saying, how I guess how the diagnosis and treatment options and whatever are being presented to the individual. And that seems to be an interesting place that maybe we're falling short has anyone given any kind of insight into how they would have wanted to be counseled or be made aware that this is something that's there, and to validate their feelings more, to kind of, I guess, maybe make the diagnosis more palatable, or just make the process less scary, I would say.
Yeah. So a couple of different things there. Um, my chart is a wonderful thing and I love it. And I'm so grateful for improved medical communication. But the flip side is that sometimes people are getting brain tumor diagnoses in their my chart. And I just don't feel like getting a email notification that you have a brain tumor is like the way. And I know that they're working on that, and some health systems are better than others about like a doctor reviewing it before it gets added to your records and things. But that I feel like isn't great. And then people like me get the phone call, which also isn't phenomenal because it's like, what are you doing when you get a call that you have a brain tumor? Like, is this like really a safe and like good place to do it? I obviously think it would be good for people to get that in office where they can get information and like know that they're in a place to hear that news. I feel like that's a place that we fall short. Honestly, though, my biggest soapbox on where we fall short in this, there's a lot of different therapies and assistance that go on with an acoustic neuroma diagnosis, especially if you have good treatment. And I just do want to say that not all treatment is equal with an acoustic neuroma. It is a rare brain tumor. And so even if you go to a neurosurgeon, they may have never operated on one or maybe one. And so it's really important if you have the ability to do your research and go to a team that does these regularly. It makes a humongous difference on outcome. I have heard so many stories, and oh my goodness, I cannot stress enough how important it is that your team is experienced. And if you have an experienced team, they often kind of have a whole little pathway that they send you on, like these are your doctors, these are your therapists, this is what you do, this is what you do, this is what you do. For example, when you have the surgery, they typically remove the vestibular nerve because the tumor is on it. So for most folks, there is some sort of needing to relearn balance. For example, for myself, when I woke up and I was very motion sick to start with, but when they got me moving and physical therapy was working with me, they had me just stand on a pillow and over I went, like I had to really relearn all of my balance in many ways. And so first I was with physical therapy, and some people have, occupational therapy and all those sorts of things. And then I got discharged right into vestibular therapy to keep working on my balance, which made all the difference in the world. And I can't recommend enough. But anyway, they had this whole like packet of things that they sent me through that helped me through all these various things. What they did not have in any capacity, and this is true across the board for everyone I've talked to with an acoustic neuroma, is auditory rehabilitation. It is completely missing, and it is a puzzle piece we need so badly, because for most of us, we go from being hearing to being hard of hearing like almost instantaneously. Maybe you've had a bit of hearing loss before the treatment, but I don't have exact statistics, but it's a huge number that go from maybe a little hearing loss to single-sided deaf in a day. And to figure that out, as Carly and other people who have sudden hearing loss can attest, like it's challenging, it's hard. And there is no one who counsels us and walks us through. And there's so much that can be done, even without hearing devices, just with lifestyle, with environment, with knowing how to plan. I am a sort of person who does a lot of research and finds things. And so I was very fortunate. I found good resources. I happened to have someone in my life, two people actually, who were single-sided deaf, who I could like meet with and get tips from. But that's just not the case. And I actively went looking for this because I'm like, something has to exist to like teach people how to be hard of hearing, essentially. And I found auditory rehabilitation maybe 6, 7 years out. And I found someone who was offering it that I could do like a free session because they were training graduate students. And it was phenomenal. And I was like, this should be part of what is given people. And I don't know why it isn't. And the professor who I was working with told me it's an insurance thing. They have a hard time billing for it. And because I had originally thought, well, maybe speech pathology would offer this. And it seemed like everyone I talked to was like, well, I only work with kids, or I only work with this, or I only work with that. And there's this gap where an adult who becomes hard of hearing like can't really get help except for going to an audiologist and trying out hearing devices, which is useful. But there's more that is so helpful that just doesn't exist. And like if I had one wish, I would wish that this was offered, because this is really what people diagnosed with an acoustic neuroma really need.
It's so similar to the gaps that I found as well, Emily, with the sudden hearing loss, because one day you're fully hearing, perhaps. The next day, maybe you're half hearing, maybe you're partial hearing, maybe you're completely deaf. And there's for me and for many other people, there is no, apart from that meeting with an audiologist who will be able to assess you for the actual equipment that could possibly help you, there was no help to help me figure out just what is life with hearing loss. I'd never even considered this. That's why I started being a coach for this. This is why I trained to be a coach, to try and fill that gap, to just help people, with the confidence loss that can come with losing your hearing, with how do I do my job with hearing loss? How do I go into the supermarket with hearing loss? How do I go to a restaurant with hearing loss? How do I be myself with hearing loss? And there's so many things to figure out here. And this gap isn't a small gap. As you know, it's massive. It's not just that hearing side as well. It's that emotional side. It's like, how do I deal with all these emotions that come with this? And I actually, for me and for many people, this is the hardest part of it. So why on earth is there not somebody there like helping? And very similar, like you said, with the rehabilitation and everything, it should be there. And for people with acoustic neuroma as well, it's the same. It's the same kind of gap there that's needed. And it's just so strange that this is what the area that's not even covered in support. So it gets me riled up when I hear about it, because it's just so, I find it very odd, and
Yes.
there's such a need for it.
Yes, we should get on the soapbox together, Carly. I will join you because this is also something I'm very passionate about. It is
Mhm.
very frustrating that this
Yeah.
does not exist. And there are,
Mhm.
it's particularly frustrating because the programs are developed. They're just not offered. And so
Uh-huh.
like that is what really I think gets me fiery, is like it exists, but we aren't given it. And so the fact that hearing loss is treated like it's not important, like we don't need it. And I'm like, these are adults who want to be a part of life and the
Mhm.
workforce and all of these things that we want. I don't understand why we wouldn't do what we can to give them those skills so they can be successful members of the community.
Mhm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Our hearing is what keeps us connected.
Right.
You just gave me another avenue to explore. So in my private practice, we do auditory processing evaluations and a lot of oral rehab, not just for patients with auditory processing, but with other hearing concerns. And as much as we are pretty much at capacity, but definitely going to reach out to my colleagues who deal with a lot of acoustic neuromas and say that this will help close the gap for some of those patients who want to do the rehab. Not
Yes.
everybody is open to
Mhm.
it, even if you offer it, that's the challenging part. And part of it is also, yes, there is a lack of insurance coverage, and there has to be advocacy on the Medicare and insurance side, and that does have to come from like the national societies to kind of push that for sure. Um, but that's a population that I didn't even think to address. So you're educating me as well, which is good.
Well, if you start, please loop me in and loop in the Acoustic Neuroma Association, because, I have one person right now that I send people to, and she can only take so many people. So please.
Yeah, for sure. I would loop you in with Dr. Morales, and maybe you guys can meet and chat. She does all of the rehab. She's actually trained in speech therapy and audiology, which is what makes her so ideal to do this kind of work, because that's just her niche.
Wonderful.
Emily, we're coming towards the end of the podcast, but I just want you to quickly tell us You were talking about your bone anchored hearing aid and saying how much you love it. Could you just quickly tell us perhaps a bit about what getting a bone anchored hearing aid entails, but also why you love it so much?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I started looking into hearing loss solutions, I don't know, about 4 or 5 months after my brain surgery. Obviously, I had a whole lot of healing and recovery to do after that and needed to prioritize that. I often talk to people with acoustic neuromas who wait even longer because there is just a lot going on. And so sometimes in that situation, the hearing loss is sort of the last thing you deal with because everything else is more acute. When I went and tested out devices, I tried out cross hearing aids. I tried out the bone anchored hearing aid. Those are the two most common options when you have an acoustic neuroma. Very infrequently are you a cochlear implant candidate because your auditory nerve is typically destroyed, and so cochlear implant is not an option. So I tried both, and I did not like traditional cross hearing aids. It wasn't a fit for my lifestyle, and sometimes you go and you try things and you find things you never knew about yourself. Like I had tiny ear canals, and so they were very uncomfortable. I also really disliked having any sound blocked in my hearing ear because I rely on that so heavily. That little bit of like muffling from wearing a hearing aid in the hearing ear was challenging because when you wear a cross aid, you have to wear essentially a microphone that picks up sound in the deaf ear and it sends it over to the hearing aid in the hearing ear. So you're wearing two aids, even though your deaf ear, in my situation, isn't actually able to hear anything. So for a bone anchored hearing aid, I was also able to test that out with a headband. And similarly, it's a sound rerouting. So it's picking up sound and it's sending it over to my hearing ear. So even with a bone anchored hearing aid or cross hearing aids, sound location is not a possibility. Cochlear implant is the only way to do that when you have single-sided deafness like me. So I couldn't do sound location, but I could pick up sound on my deaf side and have my right ear, that's my hearing ear, process it for me. So I tested it out in the office. Unfortunately, wasn't able to trial it at home, which I know some devices and some audiology places you can test at home, which is always preferable because it's great to test it in your real environment. I was only able to test in clinic. I just really liked the sound. I liked how it felt. I I just felt like it came through really well. So I got very excited about it and I decided to do the surgery. And I'm not gonna lie, opting for another surgery after a brain surgery was like not exciting at all. It was a bit daunting, but I was reassured by everyone that it's more like getting a dental implant than like having brain surgery. It's not as invasive as a cochlear implant. To get a bone anchored hearing aid, they're essentially just installing an abutment or like a peg almost into your skull. It's tiny. It barely sticks out at all. It's an outpatient surgery, and it really didn't impact my life a lot. The surgery day, I didn't feel spectacular because anesthesia and all that good stuff. But after that, I was fine. I had to heal up for, I believe, 2 weeks before I got my processor. So the recovery was really nothing in the scheme of things. It's really just healing the skin around the post. And unlike a cochlear implant also, then the day when I got it, I put it on and I could hear with it instantaneously. Like there was pretty much no adjustment, just getting used to wearing it in that it works through bone conduction, which is vibration. So it picks up the sound and it vibrates. And then it took a little bit for me to get used to that, especially for more bass tones. It's like, oh man, it really vibrates. But after a very short period of time, it just became totally background, the vibration. I don't notice it at all anymore. And I find it very comfortable. You often hear with hearing aids, sore ears or tired or whatever. I've never had that experience. I put it on in the morning and I take it off when I go to bed, and I wear it all day, every day, unless I'm going to be in water or various things where I can't wear it. It is quieter than my real ear. It sounds a little bit different, not as different as I hear cochlear implant, especially when you start. It mostly sounds a little bit like it's not, I don't want to say robotic, but a little bit like tinny maybe is the right description. Yeah, and it's quieter than my regular ear, but otherwise I just snap it on and I go about my day. It helps me out a lot because I love being notified when there's something on my deaf side. For example, when I didn't have it, small things like turning quickly and running into someone because they walked up on my deaf side and I didn't realize they were there. Or if I'm out riding my bicycle, like hearing the traffic and like those sorts of safety things, I just absolutely love. In quiet circumstances, my word recognition is 100%. In background noise, my word recognition is 83%. So I get a lot of benefit from it. When I just use one ear, my word recognition is 60%. And so then it goes up to 83 with my bone anchored hearing aid and background noise. So big impact. It really helps with my hearing fatigue and just in general makes my life easier. My job is such that I have a lot of background noise. I'm often in a situation with lots of staff, lots of customers. I don't get to do a quiet work environment much of the time. I try and hide in my office every once in a while and take breaks. So if I don't wear my hearing aid to work, I'll be there about 10 minutes and I'm like, oh no, I gotta go get my hearing aid because it makes that much of a difference in my day to day. And everybody is, situation and results can be so different. I know one thing that really impacts how functional a bone anchored hearing aid is the placement. And with the brain tumor, I have an incision on that side of my head. And so placement can be tricky for some people. It happened that where my tumor and incision were, I could get my bone anchored hearing aid in the almost optimal location, which was really nice. And I think is part of why I've had such success because it's in a great spot to pick up sound.
That's a great, I guess, advocacy story and definitely reduction of the stigma aspect of things. I actually part of my practice is out in Bermuda, and they were just doing a survey about, individuals that pursue hearing help in general. And I was saying that sometimes it's not always cost. A lot of it is the stigma or the bad rep that it gets, that people think like, oh, their hearing aids don't work, but that's not always the case. It could be part of the counseling. It could be that there's the lack of the oral rehab. It could be that maybe you weren't fit properly, and that if you do get fit properly, you'll have a better experience. So to hear your positive experience is huge. And I think that's something that really should be shared. And I'm glad that you have your platform to share it because I think that's what the community needs to take that next step and try to get help.
I totally agree. I'm very comfortable sharing, and I know some people aren't, or they feel uh, like people will judge them. And it's funny because, no one ever assumes I have hearing loss. I was in the hospital for a surgery and I had a nurse be like, oh, you don't have a hearing aid that I need to worry about taking off before the surgery. And I was like, I do. Yes. You should read all the things on your checklist and not assume just because I'm young. And so I'm very happy to tell people about it. No one ever sees it. I was actually at a hearing loss convention and everyone assumed I was hearing. And I'm like, no, I have hearing loss too. And I think there's just not enough information shared in general as well. When you're talking about not being fitted properly, not being counseled, like that is such an issue. I think having real expectations for what a hearing device can provide and what difference it can make in your life makes a huge difference because if you go in thinking you're going to get something you're not, you're just never going to like it because it's never going to offer that. And I think knowing, the cost benefit analysis and being able to do that for your life makes such a difference.
Definitely. It's so great hearing you talk about your bone anchored hearing aid as such a positive thing because I think in the world of online support groups and these kind of things, of course you'll find people who will advocate for hearing technology, but there are also people there. They're there because they're struggling with something, and if that something is their hearing aid, their bone anchored hearing aid, their cochlear implant, whatever that may be, then often they will bring negativity with that. And you know, you need to hear both sides of the story, of course, but sometimes when people are overwhelmed with that negativity, that can also impact on them making a decision for themselves when it comes to their own hearing technology. So I think there are two things there that you've mentioned. Firstly, just having the information, having good information, having, you know, good expectations, expectations that are, you know, you're not going to come out having the same hearing you had years ago or before, whatever loss you had. You know, your hearing's going to be different, but hearing devices can help, and here's how they can help. Plus hearing good stories, perhaps not so good stories, but an all-round approach to this. And it is refreshing hearing positivity when it comes to having a hearing device. So yeah, it's really great that you shared that with us, Emily.
Yes. And I would just add to doing your research because, for example, because I have no hearing on my deaf side and the sound has to go all the way over to my other side, I was always told by my audiologist to get a superpower or a power version of a bone anchored hearing aid because there's often a power and a mini, at least with Oticon. And I've talked to other people who weren't even given the option of a power version, even though they had an acoustic neuroma like me, and they're also doing sound rerouting. And then I wonder, well, these people who are saying they don't really like their bone anchored hearing aid, do they have the right version? You know, all of those pieces go into it. And unfortunately, you can't always trust the medical system to carry you. And with bone anchored hearing aids, I feel like they're often very much a corner case. They just don't have the amount of users that cochlear implants or regular hearing aids have. And so I think it's even more important to do your research and to find knowledgeable people because, you know, I have even called my insurance like 4 or 5 times to get the right information because I talked to the insurance agent and they don't even know what a bone anchored hearing aid is and what it's covered under. And I kept trying to figure out what it was going to cost me. And they're like, well, I don't know. Is it covered under hearing aids? Is it covered under surgery? Is it covered under durable medical equipment? Like, I got a different answer every time. So just unfortunately, being prepared to do that legwork.
For sure. Well, thank you so much. This was so educational and so informative, and I think it's going to be great for people to relate to and to hear your story. And I guess our shared stories, because we all kind of have a similar connection, I would guess, but just different paths. And I think it's just a nice way to connect. And I really appreciate you sharing with us today, Emily.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
definitely. Emily, we will share your links in our podcast description in our write-up. So yeah, so anyone listening to this, have a look at the podcast description and you can get Emily's links and contact her, I assume, Emily.
That sounds great. Yeah, anyone who wants to chat with me about acoustic neuromas, single-sided hearing, regular hearing loss, I'm happy to be contacted about any of those topics.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Emily. Thanks. Bye.